Good evening, everyone. My name is Kaylee Paray-Shaughnessy. I am the director of the Whittier Birthplace. Thank you for joining us tonight for The Witch of Wenham, Whittier's poem and the real witch trials that inspired it. Tonight's program is supported by a grant from the Bridge Street Fund, a special initiative of Mass Humanities. So thank you, Mass Humanities. I am pleased to present Jane Bowers, the curator for the Wenham Museum. She's going to be talking about the history behind the Witch of Wenham. So take it away, Jane.
Thank you, Kaylee. So I am here in my office. I'm going to apologize in advance for the mess that you see behind me, but I'm mostly going to be screen sharing anyway. But I am a working exhibitions curator, which means that I have all kinds of tools that I use pretty much on a daily basis, and I'm very messy. So that's kind of what you're sort of stuck with. But it's 7:05, so why don't we, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation. This is a talk that I've given several times. I have tweaked it a little bit for tonight's presentation because, you know, we're specifically talking about Whittier and his interest in the witch trials. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the witch trials themselves, and also make sure that we touch on the differences between the sort of romantic vision that Whittier had of the Witch of Wenham and an actual person who lived in Wenham during most of her life. So here we go. Find the right one. Oops, sorry. There we go. Okay. So this is Wenham and the Witch Trials, Sarah Solart Poole Good, Reverend Joseph Garish, and the Witch Hysteria of 1692. So I'm going to start with a little bit about Whittier's poem. It's here on your screen. The real poem is 60 stanzas long, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. But this is a couple of stanzas that describe what she looked like and some of the things that she did. So I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. A blue-eyed witch sits on the bank and weaves her net for thee. She weaves her golden hair. She sings her spell song low and faint. The wickedest witch in Salem jail is to that girl a saint. And many a good wife heard her speak by Wenham water words that made the buttercups take wings and turn to yellow birds. So the image that you see there was actually my artistic take on the Witch of Wenham Lake. I work at the Wenham Museum, and one of the programs that we sponsor here at Wenham is called Art Grows Here. And it's a program where people from around the towns of Hamilton and Wenham can create art projects, outdoor art projects, and install them in their yards. And the museum produces a map where all the art projects are. And so this particular year, I was inspired by the Whittier poem because I didn't know that it existed until 2018 when I found it. And so this sculpture is actually based on this particular section of the poem where he talks about the proof that many of the people in Wenham use to prove that she is in fact a witch, where she's turning yellow buttercups into birds. So in case you're curious, the reason she's glowing is that the body of the witch was made from chicken wire that I molded into the form of a person. Her golden hair was a piece of aluminum screen, that window screen that I painted gold, and the buttercups being turned into birds that are flying around her is yellow coroplast. And the reason she's glowing is that the whole thing was placed over a landscape light, and I took this photograph at night when the light was on. So anyway, that's my little plug for Art Grows Here. The poem that Whittier wrote is extremely romantic, and I mean that both with the lowercase r and the uppercase r, and in terms of the definition of romantic. It's a take on the witch persecutions in Salem, most of us are aware that the reality was far more brutal and tragic than the poem's outcome. And the actual Witch of Wenham, if we're going to call her that, did not survive. But I suppose I should have called spoiler alert, because in Whittier's poem she does. Anyway, for those of you who haven't read it, Kaylee can probably give you a link to where you can find it if you want to read all 60 stanzas. In any case, the real person who we will refer to as the Witch of Wenham was named Sarah Solart Poole Good. She was born and raised in Wenham, and she lived here until she was well into her 30s. She and her family didn't move to Salem Village until about 1686. So she was a Wenham resident for most of her life. So we're briefly going to go through a timeline of the events of the witch trials themselves, because it's important to have some context, and not everybody has that information. So in January, Salem Village, which is essentially where the hysteria started, it's now the town of Danvers, a couple of girls, Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams, who lived with their uncle, or lived with the minister in the town, they began to have bouts of strange behavior. And other girls started to sort of have similar kinds of behaviors. And in February, the first arrests were made. So these girls, the first girls who started having these fits, it was Reverend Samuel Parris's daughter, Elizabeth, or also known as Betty, and his niece, Abigail. The description that they have about the behaviors, in today's world, they look a lot like epilepsy. Did they actually have epilepsy? Probably not, but it's really hard to say, 300 plus years later, what it was. But no medical explanation was found at the time, and it was actually their doctor who first suggested that it might be the result of witchcraft. Over several months following, the accusations grew and grew. Some people referred to the spread of these accusations as an outbreak, almost like it was a disease. And, essentially, by the time all was said and done, roughly a year later, 25 people died as a direct result of the hysteria. 19 of those people were hanged, one person was pressed to death, and 5 others died in prison due to the brutal conditions. The Parris's enslaved servant named Tituba was the first to be accused by Betty and Abigail. And after that, other girls, as I said, started to exhibit the same behaviors. And in February, Tituba, Sarah Osborne, and Sarah Solart Poole Good, who is the hero of our particular story tonight, were arrested for witchcraft. I think it's worth noting, however, here that Tituba confessed to being a witch in a very bizarre statement, but she wasn't executed, and nor was anyone else who ever confessed. So it makes you think twice about the criteria they were using. Essentially, if they accused you of witchcraft and you confessed, then they would let you go. If you didn't confess, in other words, you didn't lie and you didn't say you were a witch, then you might get hanged. So in any case, let us move on. In March, more girls joined in the accusations. Judges John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin began examining the accused. Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse were both charged and arrested. And Dorcas, also known as Dorothy Good, the 5-year-old daughter of Sarah Good, was also accused and arrested. interesting thing to know about here, in case you haven't heard it before, Judge John Hathorne was actually Nathaniel Hawthorne's, the author's, 2 times great-grandfather. And it was Hawthorne who actually added the W to the middle of the name. Rumor has it that it was because he was embarrassed that his ancestor was involved in the witch trials. Whether that's true or not, it's hard to know, but Hawthorne is the one who added the W. And the 2 judges were given the responsibility to examine the accused and look for what was known as a witch's mark. So this would often be identified, what we would identify probably as a mole. And supposedly the myth was that the accused witch, or the witch, would feed the familiar, her familiar, which was sort of like a animal protector, sometimes in the form of a bird or a cat. In Dorothy Good's case, she said it was a snake, because Dorothy did in fact confess to being a witch, even though she was only 5 years old at the time that she was arrested. Anyway, they would feed the familiar their own blood. Between March and April, 9 more people were accused. Worth noting here again that by the end of the hysteria in the autumn of 1693, more than 200 people were accused, 156 were arrested, 30 were tried and convicted, and of those 30, as I said earlier, 19 were ultimately hanged, 1 was pressed to death, and 5 died in prison. All those remaining were eventually released without trial. By the time we get to the spring, again, more accusations. Elizabeth Proctor, John Proctor was her husband, Bridget Bishop, Abigail Hobbs, Mary Warren, and Giles Corey, among others, were also being charged. In May, Sarah Osborne died in prison before she could be tried. Increase Mather returned from England with a new charter for the colony and a new governor, Sir William Phipps. He'll be important in a minute. Governor Phipps set up a special court to try the cases, known as the Court of Oyer and Termine. This is the Court of Oyer and Termine is a French legal term which literally means to hear and determine. And this was the court that was specifically set up for the witch trials. Now we get into the summer. In June, Bridget Bishop was hanged. She died on June 10th of 1692. She was the victim of the first execution on what is now known as Proctor's Ledge. Some very wonderful history was done by the folks at Salem State University, and they've pretty much verified that Proctor's Ledge is where the executions happened, not at what is traditionally known in Salem, the city of Salem, as Gallows Hill. We have here, I put down here a little, this is a photo of the memorial that was set up in 2017. In July, Susanna Martin, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds were hanged. That happened on July 29th. And then in August, John Proctor, George Jacob Sr., George Barrows, Martha Carrier, John Willard were all hanged on August 19th. We get to September, and here's poor Giles Corey. Giles Corey was pressed to death on September 19th, and you might be wondering why he was pressed to death instead of hanged. Well, Giles Corey was never actually tried. He refused to enter a plea of any kind. He refused to acknowledge that the court had a right to try him. And at the time, a person who refused to enter a plea, they could not be tried. That was the law. However, you were, if you were the state, if you were the colony in this case, you did have a legal remedy for this, and it was called peine forte et dure, which is another French legal term, which means hard and forceful punishment. And the prisoner is essentially stripped naked, laid under a board, and then boulders or rocks are placed on the board until he or she confesses. In Corey's case, again, we don't know for sure, but it's reported that when he was being pressed, he only uttered the words "more weight" in kind of a sarcastic sort of "F you," I guess, to the people who were treating him so badly. It was a very unusual situation. Most people would eventually just plead to end the torture. So it's rare to find incidents of people who were able to endure it, but endure it he did. And since he refused to plead, he was never tried, so he died in full possession of his estate. So this is another kind of quirk of the system at the time, which was that if you were convicted of a capital offense, in this case, witchcraft, that meant that your property, all of it, would go to the government. And so if you died after being executed, your heirs wouldn't actually get anything. And so this actually left a lot of financial devastation behind. Because Corey refused to enter a plea of any kind, and he was therefore never tried and never convicted, he died in full possession of his estate. And so it passed to his two sons-in-law, which was in accordance to his will. We're going to get back to Governor Phipps now. In October, at this point, there was a lot of outcry happening, a lot of people recognizing that, you know, this had gotten a little bit out of hand. And so Governor Phipps dissolved the court of Whittier and Termine. The last people to be hanged died on September 22nd in 1692. And as mentioned earlier, by the end of the trials, all these folks had died, 25 in all. In November, people were still being accused and arrested, but the cases were no longer being tried, as I said, in the court of Whittier and Termine. They were tried in the Superior Court. And other interesting things happened. And this is where we sort of get more involved in what happened here in Wenham. The minister here in Wenham was named Joseph Garish, and the minister in Beverly, Massachusetts was named John Hale. Now, you may be familiar with the name John Hale. He was sort of a mover and a shaker behind the witch trials. He was completely convinced that witchcraft and witches were at work in Salem. And he had this interesting meeting that we'll get to in more detail in a bit, between himself, Reverend Joseph Garish, as I said, the minister here in Wenham, and a young woman named Mary Herrick, who's a little bit mysterious, but we'll talk to her about her in a moment as well. By May 1693, the last of those accused were released and or just pardoned by Governor Phipps, whether they had been tried or not. Another interesting side note here about Tituba, who was, as I mentioned, an enslaved servant of the parish household. Tituba was released from prison, but she was sold back into slavery because this was to pay her expenses, and I'm using air quotes there, that she incurred while she was in prison. So now we get to Joseph Garish. He was a very interesting figure. He was one of the few people of kind of a high status who was willing to speak out loud against the trials and the hysteria in general that was going on. He did 4 things that are sort of related to the witch trials and his opposition to them. And we'll go through them point by point, but let's start with, he signed the return of several ministers, which is a document I'll talk about in a second. Interestingly enough, 4 of his parishioners were actually members of the jury. And even though he was their minister speaking out against it, they still were members of the jury. As I mentioned on the previous screen, he heard testimony from Mary Herrick about Sarah Hale, who was John Hale's wife at the time. And 10 years after the trials ended, he signed another document called the Petition of 11 Ministers. So we're going to go through these one by one. In my opinion, Gerrish is pretty much the second most important person who was involved in the trials from Wenham. And I say that because the first most important person is Sarah Good herself, but let's stick with Gerrish for the moment. Joseph Gerrish was the second occupant of what is now the Claflin Gerrish Richards house. His part of the house that he lived in was this right here. This section right here was actually added by the museum after we took it over. So this front section and the back section of the house are what he had when he lived here. As far as Gerrish is concerned, he was something of a rarity in the colony, in that he was outspoken, as I said, about his objections to the trial, but the witch trials. But the objections were really very much more specific about the kind of evidence that was being used against those being accused of witchcraft. And that was known as spectral evidence. So if you're not familiar with the term spectral evidence, essentially what that was the belief that the specter or the spirit of a person could come out of their body. In this case, it would be a witch's body, and do harm to the person, usually to the accuser. Now, the problem with this is that you couldn't really fight against it because nobody else could see it. It was only the person who was doing the accusation who could see the specter. And so the spectral evidence had long since stopped being used in England itself, but it was still being used here in the colony. And we don't know whether Gerrish actually believed in witchcraft or believed that there were witches at work causing problems. But we do know that he believed that spectral evidence should not be part of the evidence that was being used against them. Let's get back to these points that I wanted to make. Let's talk about the return of several ministers. This is really the most important evidence of Gerrish's public objection to the trials. The return of several ministers is dated June 15, 1692. And it's a public statement that cautioned the court against the use of spectral evidence. So several ministers signed it. I can give you a list of their names if you really want them. But several ministers signed it. And as I said, it cautioned against the use of the spectral evidence because it was not permitted in the courts in England. Second point here, 4 of Gerrish's parishioners were jurors. They were Captain Thomas Fisk Sr., who was the jury foreman for all of the trials, by the way. This wasn't just some of the trials, this was all of the trials. Captain Thomas Fisk Jr., who was the son of Captain Thomas Fisk Sr., Deacon William Fisk, who was a relative of the Fisks, and John Batchelder. One of the more interesting things, although not necessarily the most important, was the third point here, which is the testimony of Mary Herrick. So on November 14, 1692, the Reverends Gerrish and Hale heard testimony from this young woman named Mary Herrick. Unfortunately, Mary Herrick's a bit of a mystery. We don't know exactly who she is. I have a colleague who did some research at Historic Beverly who believes that she found a Sarah Herrick, also known as Sarah Mary or Mary Sarah Herrick, who was born in 1673. So that would have made her roughly 19 years old when she spoke to, if this is the correct Mary Herrick, that would have made her about 19 years old when she spoke with Reverends Hale and Gerrish. The other kind of weird thing here is that if she was born in Beverly or lived in Beverly, that meant that Hale would have been her minister, not Gerrish. So why she went to Gerrish first is also a little odd. We're not really sure what's going on there. And there are so many Mary Herricks it's hard to pinpoint who she was, if this is even the right person. In any case, in the document where Reverend Garish writes out what Mary Herrick said, he describes her as being, quote, about 17 years old. So it's possible that this 19-year-old Mary Herrick is the correct person. We don't know for sure. In any case, Mary claimed that and this is her term, ghost, quote, ghost of Mary Eastie, whom you will recall had been executed on September 22nd, 1692, visited her and protested her innocence to her. And in other words, what she said is Mary Eastie's ghost appeared and cried, "I am innocent, I am innocent." She also claimed, that is Mary Herrick claimed, that the shape, and again, that is the term that Mary Herrick is using, the shape of Reverend Hale's wife, who was named Sarah Noyes Hale, did, and again, this is a quote, did sorely afflict her by pinching, pricking, and choking her. And what she meant by shape, again, we don't know. This sounds like spectral evidence. It sounds like an accusation. However, having said that, Hale and Garish questioned Mary Herrick quite closely. And eventually, in an addendum to this document, she says that she now believed that what she saw, what she experienced, she never describes it as a vision, but what she experienced, she says, was all a delusion of the devil. And that is, her testimony did not accuse Reverend Hale's wife of witchcraft, but rather Mary's experience made her believe that all of the incidents of witchcraft were actually works of the devil, not works of witches. So we can take that for what it means. It's also important to note at this point that around this time, perhaps before, Reverend Hale began to change his mind, or appears to have begun to change his mind about witchcraft. He came to believe that the devil could in fact take the form of innocent people. Before this, the belief was that the devil could only take the shape of a person who was in fact a witch. Hale is at this point changing his mind and saying, wait a second, no, the devil can take the shape of even an innocent person. He knows his own wife is not a witch, and therefore this is another piece of evidence that shows that the devil can actually take the shape of an innocent person. In 1697, so we're jumping forward in time, but it's worth noting here. In 1697, Hale wrote a book entitled A Modest Inquiry into the Nature of Witchcraft. And this book was actually published posthumously in 1702. But in that, he expresses the same notion that the devil can, in fact, appear to people, even if the person whose shape he is taking on is innocent. And the accusations at this point were kind of dwindling anyway. At the point that Mary Herrick gave this testimony to Hale and Garish, the accusations were dwindling. And so this incident is sort of a little bit of an afterthought, but it is interesting, and it was noted at the time that it happened in a lot of documents that this meeting happened. So take that for what you will. Anyway, the fourth point here is that Garish also signed the petition of 11 ministers. So this was a document that was signed 10 years after the trials had ended. And it was Garish's last public act in reference to the witchcraft hysteria. And you could consider it another form of speaking out against the injustice of the witchcraft, the witch trials. And it was a petition that was addressed to His Excellency, the Governor, Council, and representatives of the province of the Massachusetts Bay in General Court. And it was also signed by 10 other ministers. Again, I can give you their names if you're interested. And this was signed in 1703, so almost exactly 10 years after the trials had ended. And this petition was actually in support of a number of other petitions that were also sent to the province, General Court. And these petitions were sent in support of pardoning, essentially removing the convictions of several of those people who were accused of witchcraft but survived the trials, and the relatives also of the people who were actually executed. This particular petition reads in part, quote, "Some of the condemned persons aforesaid and others on behalf of their relations who have suffered have lately petitioned this honored court upon this account. We pray that their case may be duly considered." In response to this and these other petitions, the council submitted a bill on July 20th, 1703 to formally outlaw the use of spectral evidence. And about 8 years later, in 1711, the colony passed a bill pardoning 22 of those people who had been accused of witchcraft and granted them some monetary restitution. This was only to some of the surviving victims and their families. But this bill only involved those victims whose relatives specifically came forward and asked for the pardons and the restitution. If no one spoke for a particular victim, then they were not pardoned, and they stayed officially convicted on the books for literally hundreds of years. Now, let's get to Sarah. Sarah was born in Wenham in 1653. She had a relatively comfortable life. Her family, her father was an innkeeper, and they were successful. She would have had a quite comfortable life. The image that you see here on the left is not a portrait of Sarah. It is a portrait of Margaret Gibbs, done by an unknown artist known as the Freak Gibbs portrait painter. But it's a similar time period of a girl of a similar age, and she would have had a comfortable life. And this is a representative piece of artwork that sort of gives us an idea of what she may have, or the lifestyle that she may have lived. Unfortunately, Sarah Good's father committed suicide when she was 19 years old. A few years later, she married Daniel Poole, who was a former indentured servant. Following his death, she married William Good, also a former indentured servant. And in 1686, as I mentioned, they moved to Salem Village, or sometime around that point. Her daughter, Dorothy, aka Dorcas, was probably born in Salem Village around 1687 or so. So who was she really? These are just sort of facts about her life. Well, she was the daughter of a wealthy tavern keeper when she was young. She was financially devastated as a young adult. She was a wife, she was a widow, she was a mother. She was a mother of at least 2 children, one of whom died in prison. She was among the first 3 women who was accused of and eventually executed for witchcraft. And she had a tragic life. As I mentioned, she was born in 1653. And when her father committed suicide, he had left no will. But there were a couple of witnesses to his drowning death, his drowning suicide. And this testimony stated that his wife should receive 1/3 of his estate, which was actually the law anyway. It was known as the widow's third. Widows were required by law to receive at least 1/3 of their husband's estate, so that you wouldn't have a lot of financially destitute women running around. And the rest of his estate, according to this testimony, was supposed to be evenly distributed amongst his children. Well, she was one of, we think, 7 children. And so she should have been okay. That is, Sarah should have been okay financially. However, unfortunately, Sarah's mother, who was also named Sarah, she remarried very quickly after her first husband's death. And her new husband denied most of the Solart children their portions of the father's estate. John Solart's 2 sons got their share, but the 5 daughters got nothing. And the reason for this is that the administration of the estate after John Solart's death was granted to the elder Sarah Solart, John's widow. But because she remarried so quickly, all of her property then became the property of her new husband. And it's essentially the idiosyncrasies of the law that favored men over women. And so once her property became the property of her new husband, the distribution of the estate, her former or her late husband's estate, fell to her new husband, and he essentially just didn't distribute the property the way he should have. And so his stepsons got their share, but his stepdaughters did not get theirs. About 10 years after John Solart's suicide, the Solart daughters did petition the court of Massachusetts Bay Colony to get their rightful inheritance, and their brothers were granted, they won in court, and their brothers were granted the responsibility of distributing the estate, but it was already 10 years later. So Woodward had already spent most of what was left of his wife's late husband's estate. So there wasn't anything left to inherit, or at least not much. So what Sarah got ultimately was a small piece of property that was referred to as a meadow. It's a fraction of what she would have received had she received it 10 years earlier when she should have. And during this period, Sarah's first husband, during this 10-year period, Sarah's first husband racked up a lot of debt. And when the younger Sarah's first husband died with all of this debt, and Sarah remarried, she was required then to pay off her late husband's debts. So she and her new husband were again left financially devastated. Things were just not working out at all. And it was at this point that Sarah and her new husband moved to Salem. So Sarah and her daughter, Dorothy, they traveled to a lot of homes, essentially begging for help. And the rumor is that her husband actually had difficulty keeping jobs because of his wife's behavior. This all was a form of probably mental illness for Sarah. We don't really know. She may have suffered from substance use disorder. She may have had some kind of mental illness. We don't really know. But they had virtually nothing. And she was an outsider. She was not well liked in Salem. She was described as being spiteful and malicious. And she would often walk away muttering to herself after she had begged for some sort of charity from her neighbors, especially if she did not receive as much as she thought she should have, and would essentially complain that you didn't give me enough. And this was actually some of the evidence that was used against her in her trial for witchcraft. On March 1st, 1692, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Titaba were arrested, and they were all tried that day. And less than a month later, her 5-year-old daughter, Dorothy Good, was arrested and also confessed that she was a witch. I thought that it was particularly poignant. This is a contemporary portrait made from an artist's imagination of what Dorothy Good would have looked like. It's a 21st century portrait, but I think it's important to remember she was 5 and she was put in prison. As I mentioned earlier, Sarah Good was one of the first 3 women to be accused of witchcraft in Salem Village. And there was so much testimony against her that her conviction was pretty much a foregone conclusion. She was a disliked outsider. She was an easy target for accusations. And that is actually true for most of the people, at least in the initial accusations. You know, Titaba is a good example of that. A woman of color, outsider, strange culture, strange habits. Sarah Good's another example, muttering to herself, an outsider, not well liked. strange, mysterious things happened in her past. Like, I'm sure it was known to everybody that her father had committed suicide and so on. In addition to that, her husband and her daughter, 5-year-old daughter, both testified against her. William, her husband, said that she, quote, either was a witch or would be one very quickly. And when asked why, he replied that it was her bad carriage to him. He also said that she was an enemy to all good. 5-year-old Dorothy confessed to being a witch herself and also incriminated her mother and said that she had seen her mother consorting with the devil. One of the more shocking aspects to the interrogations, in my opinion, was that throughout the trials, there was a lot of blatant prejudgment and editorializing of the testimony. So in the transcript of the interrogation of Sarah Good, at the very bottom of it, the court reporter, basically the person taking the notes about the questioning, the interrogation of Sarah Good, this person actually wrote at the end, quote, her answers were in a very wicked, spiteful manner, reflecting and retorting against the authority with base and abusive words and many lies she was taken in. So it's obvious that even the court reporter is deciding that she was lying. During her incarceration, Sarah was pregnant, and she actually gave birth to a daughter while she was in prison. So this is another thing that her daughter, Dorothy, would have witnessed. She would have witnessed her mother giving birth to her baby sister, and she would have witnessed her baby sister dying. It's believed that the infant named Mercy only lived 1 day. Dorothy herself was actually held in prison even after her mother had been executed. She was held in prison for about 8 months. And upon her release, her father noted that she was never the same. Surprisingly, shockingly, she was never the same again. So where we come to is now her death. Before she was hanged, Reverend Noyes urged Sarah to confess, and she replied, this is what my slide says, "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. If you take my life, God will give you blood to drink." And interestingly enough, Reverend Noyes actually died of a throat hemorrhage. You could say it's karma, don't know, but in any case, this happened about 25 years after Sarah had died. In any event, as I just mentioned, the Witch of Wenham in Whittier's poem, who is ultimately rescued by her sweetheart and protected by a Quaker family until the hysteria ends, was rather different from the Witch of Wenham in the person of Sarah Solart Poole Good. The memorial here was actually erected in 1992 to commemorate the lives of those who were murdered 300 years earlier. And just as a kind of an end note, following the witch trials in 1710, William Good, who was Sarah's widower, successfully sued the colonial government and won 30 pounds for the damage done to his family during the trials. We never hear from Dorothy Good again. She literally disappears from the historical record. So shockingly, as I said, she was never the same again. She probably died anonymously somewhere, but we have no idea where. As I said, there's no more record. In 1711, shortly after the 1710 victory in court, in which a number of other family members of the victims also successfully sued for the same reason, Sarah was exonerated along with several other victims. Over the next few years, more people were exonerated. In 1957, a descendant of Anne Putiator, who was one of those who was executed, but not among those exonerated in 1711, obtained a pardon for his ancestor, and a few others. But once again, unless even in 1957, unless descendants of these folks came forward and specifically wanted to be on this bill, which exonerated their ancestors, they were not included. It wasn't until 2001, 309 years after the last execution, that all of the remaining victims were granted a blanket exoneration. I think we would all agree that this was an enormous tragedy, just shocking in its scope, to the damage that it did to so many people, not just the people who were victims, who were accused, but also to their families. Reverend Hale said something quite poignant in his book, A Modest Inquiry into the Nature of Witchcraft, which I think is really appropriate here. So I'm just going to read it to you. He says, "Such was the darkness of that day, the tortures and lamentations of the afflicted, and the power of former precedents that we walked in the clouds and could not see our way." And I think that really sums it up. They were so frightened, so obsessed, so worried that they essentially took all that was around them and were blind to anything that didn't fit into the narrative, that they so desperately needed an explanation for things going badly. And witchcraft was as good an explanation as any. And so that's what they went with. So that is the end of my little talk. I'm not sure if Kaylee wanted to speak a little bit more about Whittier and his inspiration. She knows a lot more about Whittier than I do, and so can probably speak more to his poem and the inspiration for it.
Yeah, thank you. That was wonderful, Jane. I had pulled a section, like Jane mentioned, it's a very long poem, but I pulled out a few stanzas that described the interaction between the mother of the witch's sweetheart and the Reverend, who in my mind, I was picturing Reverend Garish because this is in Wenham. And she says, "Oh, Reverend Sir, my Andrew's soul the Wenham witch has caught. She holds him with the curled gold, whereof her snare is wrought. She charms him with her great blue eyes. She binds him with her hair. Oh, break the spell with holy words, unbind him with a prayer." And the Reverend goes on to answer, "Oh, sure, yeah, I'll figure it out, and we'll get this solved." But the Reverend does not succeed, and the Witch of Wenham gets put in prison, gets broken out of prison by her sweetheart. They run away, they find shelter with a Quaker family, and everybody lives happily ever after, except for maybe the mother-in-law, who's not too happy about it. But yeah, it's definitely a very rosy picture of that time, 1692. A lot of Whittier's poems describe New England in particular, and his home at the Whittier birthplace where he grew up, in very rosy terms of rural pasts. He writes a significant amount of his poetry during the Industrial Revolution, and he is able to kind of gain popularity from people who look back on their childhood and go, "Man, we had it better when we were kids. When we were on a farm, things were better. And look at this dirty city we live in now." And I see the Witch of Wenham as falling into that same kind of category of making the past seem better than it really was.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I actually use the term small r, big R, because, you know, we all know what romance is in the small r sense, but there was, even though Whittier wasn't really defined as a so-called romantic poet, he did use a lot of that same, the same themes that the romantic poets did. And this sort of, this view of women, for instance, as being these sort of morally morally gorgeous, morally high creatures, and this intense beauty that they had, this sort of innate beauty of their souls and their hearts and so on. And I think in Whittier's poem, this young woman is just, you'd have to read the whole thing, but he sort of really pounds down the point that she's completely innocent, completely wonderful, completely beautiful inside and out. And, you know, she cares for her sickly mother, and she, you know, she can't leave because she has to take care of her mother who is ill. And it's really quite wonderful because it's sort of over the top in that way. But it is a very, as Kaylee said, a rosy picture of what it was really like. And I know it's disturbing to hear these details, like this woman giving birth to an infant in prison, but it's really important to understand that these conditions were incredibly brutal. And even today, I happen to be a Salem resident. I live in downtown Salem. You know, I see people, and I have very ambivalent feelings about the tourist obsession with Salem, because to a certain extent it is celebrate might be the wrong word, but it raises it changes, I guess, changes the meaning of the witch trials, and it turns it into, to a certain extent, a fun time, instead of really having people take a moment and think about, you know, these people died in a really brutal way, and it really affected their lives, their family lives, and it really in fact affected the whole city of Salem for years and years and years. Salem did not have any interest in talking about the witch trials. It was an embarrassment to the city in general, and it really wasn't until the 1980s that Salem as a city started to embrace it as a way of improving its economic outlook. And now it was very successful. So I have kind of ambivalent feelings about that. I appreciate that Salem's a great place to live, and that the tourists, you know, help support Salem's economy. But at the same time, you know, it sort of forgets and ignores the fact that these are real people who had horrible, tragic things happen to them. So,
does anybody else have a question for Jane or for me? Feel free to unmute, or you can put it in the chat. I saw that Abby said in the chat, "Well done, thanks, Jane." With clapping hands.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I know I sort of threw a lot of information at you, so it's hard to take it in. But you know, as I said, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Susan says, learned a lot, thanks. Thank you for attending, Susan.
Jane, just curious, what did you use as your primary source material? Documents at like the Peabody Essex Museum, or from the court, or?
Yes, so the main document that we have actually is it's a document that was actually written by Reverend Garish, and Reverend Garish essentially wrote, for lack of a better description of it, he wrote the minutes of the meeting that he had between himself and John Hale and Mary Herrick. So that's how we have that information. The biographical information about Sarah Good and the other people who were accused of witchcraft, and the other sort of characters that I talked about, the other figures that I talked about, that's actually available quite easily. There's all kinds of documentation on you know, sites like you know, Ancestry.com and the witch trial papers, that actually a lot of the witch trial papers ended up in Virginia, and they have put most of those online so that they've scanned them and transcribed them and put them online. Same is true for the documents at the Peabody Essex Museum. Most of them have been transcribed and made available online. So you can pretty much find all of this information on your own. The interpretation of it is my own, but the information itself is available online.
I'll just put in that Cotton Mather also wrote a book. I forget the exact title, but it's Magic in New England, which is also considered a fairly contemporary source. I think it was written around 1700, so shortly after.
Yeah, and actually a lot of the information, for instance, when I mentioned John Hale writing about his modest inquiry into the nature of witchcraft, I should point out too that the title's much longer than that. It goes on and on. I don't remember the title exactly, but titles of books at that point would go on for like a paragraph. In any case, but in his modest inquiry, he actually writes down a lot of this information as well. His recollections of what he experienced 5 years earlier. So he was writing in 1697. The trials took place in 1692, 93, or I should say the events took place in 1692, 93. And then the book that he wrote, John Hale's book that he wrote in 1697, was actually published after his death. So it's almost contemporaneous with what was going on. I think it took John Hale a while to sort of come to his full conclusion about what he believed or did not believe about witchcraft. But again, it's hard to look into someone else's mind and know what they were thinking. But he did eventually express regret over having so enthusiastically embraced the trials. Any other questions? All right.
Oh, very interesting talk. Thank you from Jay and Fran.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad that everybody enjoyed it. And, you know, if you ever want to learn more about the sights and sounds of Wenham, where Sarah Solart Poole-Good lived, and where Reverend Garish lived, you can certainly come here to Wenham. The home where the conversation happened between John Hale, Reverend Garish, and Mary Herrick is actually the house that now belongs to the Wenham Museum. It's called the Claflin Garish Richards House, and we're open. You can look at our open hours and all information about it. A lot of people like to take these pilgrimages to the sites of the events surrounding the witch trials. So you're certainly welcome to come, and you know, you're certainly welcome to reach out to me. You can find my email address on the museum's website, wenhammuseum.org. And if you have any other questions, I'm happy to do my best to answer. And good evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much.